The voice on the other end of the phone was desperate, cracking with panic in a way I'd never heard before. Victoria Sterling Donovan, my stepmother who had once declared me financially irresponsible and a burden on the family, was now begging me to wire $50,000 to save the house I'd grown up in. The same house she'd convinced my father to ban me from 10 years earlier. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Claire, please, she whispered, her usual commanding tone reduced to something pitiful. I know we haven't talked in years, but you're the only one who can help us now. The bank is foreclosing next week, and your father doesn't know I'm calling you. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Seattle penthouse, watching the morning fog roll off Elliott Bay, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a cold clarity that came from years of building walls around the parts of me that used to break whenever the Donovan family rejected me. The woman who had systematically erased me from my own father's life was now asking me to rescue theirs. Interesting, I said, my voice steady as granite. Tell me, Victoria, what makes you think I'd help the family that disowned me? My father called me on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 10 years and 3 months ago. I remember the date because it was the night before my final presentation for the biggest client my consulting firm had ever landed, and I'd been running on coffee and determination for weeks. The call came at 9:47 p.m. Pacific Time, interrupting my last-minute prep work for a presentation that would determine whether my two-person startup would survive or crumble. Claire, we need to talk. Dad's voice sounded strangely formal, lacking the warmth that had always characterized our conversations. Even through the phone, I could hear Victoria's voice in the background, a persistent murmur that had become the soundtrack of our family dynamics ever since she'd married him 8 years earlier. I saved my work and gave him my full attention, assuming he was calling to wish me luck for tomorrow's presentation. He knew how important this deal was to my company, how Marcus and I had poured everything we had into landing this tech giant as our first major client. We'd talked about it just 2 weeks earlier when I'd visited Portland for what I thought was a family dinner, but turned out to be an intervention I hadn't seen coming. Dad, if this is about the business loan again, I told you I'm not comfortable mixing family and money, I said, settling back in my desk chair. 6 months earlier, Victoria had suggested that Dad invest in my consulting firm, claiming she wanted to support Claire's little venture. Something about the way she'd phrased it had made my skin crawl, and I'd politely declined, preferring to build my company without family complications. This isn't about the loan, Claire. This is about your future, and frankly about your attitude toward this family. His words hit me like ice water. In 28 years, my father had never spoken to me with such coldness. Victoria and I have been discussing your behavior, and we think it's time you learned some responsibility. The background murmuring stopped, and I could hear Victoria's presence more clearly now, as if she'd moved closer to the phone. My stepmother had perfected the art of influencing conversations without directly participating in them, a skill she'd honed during her previous marriage to a successful real estate developer before targeting my widowed father. My behavior? I repeated, genuinely confused. Dad, what are you talking about? Don't play innocent, Claire. The disrespect you showed Victoria at dinner 2 weeks ago was unacceptable. Questioning her suggestions about your business, dismissing her experience in real estate investment, making her feel unwelcome in her own home. I felt the ground shifting beneath me as I tried to process what he was saying. The dinner he was referring to had been uncomfortable, yes, but not because of any disrespect on my part. Victoria had spent the evening criticizing every aspect of my business model, suggesting I was naive about market realities and implying that my success so far was more luck than skill. When I defended my company's approach and politely disagreed with her assessment, she'd grown increasingly hostile, eventually accusing me of being too proud to accept help from family. Dad, I wasn't disrespectful. I simply disagreed with Victoria's business advice. That's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, Claire, and that's the problem. His voice carried a finality that made my chest tighten. You've never fully accepted Victoria as part of this family. You've never appreciated what she's brought to our lives or respected her position as my wife. This was a conversation we danced around for years, but never with such direct accusations. Victoria had married my father 3 years after my mother's death from cancer, swooping in during his grief with casseroles and sympathy that gradually transformed into something more calculated. She'd brought 2 children from her previous marriage, Kevin and Natalie, who were then 12 and 10, and had immediately begun reshaping our family dynamic to center around her vision of what we should be. I've always been polite to Victoria, I said carefully, trying to keep my voice level. If she feels I haven't been warm enough, I'm sorry, but I won't pretend to have a relationship with her that doesn't exist naturally. That attitude right there is the problem. Victoria's voice came through clearly now, apparently having taken the phone or moved close enough to speak directly. Claire, you've spent 8 years making it clear that you don't consider Kevin, Natalie, and me real family. You maintain this distance, this superiority, as if you're somehow better than the rest of us. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Victoria continued with the kind of practice speech that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times. Your father and I have built a beautiful life together, and we've included you in everything, but you've never fully participated. You come to family gatherings like you're doing us a favor. You barely interact with your siblings. You act like our home isn't your home anymore. Kevin and Natalie aren't my siblings, I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. They're your children, and I care about them, but calling them my siblings feels dishonest when we didn't grow up together and barely know each other. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my father's sharp intake of breath, and I knew I'd walked directly into the trap Victoria had been setting for years. There it is, Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Robert, do you hear that? After 8 years of marriage, after everything we've tried to do to make her feel included, she still doesn't consider us family. My father's voice returned to the phone, and the disappointment in it cut deeper than any anger could have. Claire, I'm ashamed of you. Victoria has been nothing but loving toward you, and this is how you repay her kindness. Dad, please let me explain. No, Claire, I think you've explained enough. Victoria and I have made a decision. The formal tone returned, as if he were reading from a prepared statement. We think it's time you learn to stand on your own without the safety net of family support. Maybe when you're truly independent, you'll understand the value of the family you've been taking for granted. The words didn't immediately register. I sat in my Seattle office, surrounded by the evidence of my independence, the company I'd built, the apartment I'd furnished, the life I'd created entirely without their financial support, and tried to understand what safety net he was referring to. I don't understand, Dad. What safety net? I haven't asked you for money since college. The Christmas presents, the birthday gifts, the assumption that you'll always have a room in our house, the expectation that we'll be there for every crisis or celebration in your life, the emotional and financial backup that comes with being part of a family. Victoria's voice had taken on a lecturing tone, as if she were explaining something to a child. We think it's time you experience true independence, and learn to appreciate what family actually means. You're cutting me off. The question came out as a whisper, though I still didn't fully grasp what they meant. I hadn't lived at home since college, hadn't asked for financial support in 6 years, and rarely called except for holidays and special occasions. We're giving you space to grow up, my father said. No more family dinners, no more holiday visits, no more birthday calls or Christmas presents. When you're ready to treat Victoria with the respect she deserves, and accept this family as it actually is, not as you wish it were, then we can talk about rebuilding our relationship. The room started spinning as the implications hit me. They weren't just cutting off financial support I didn't need, they were cutting off all contact. They were erasing me from the family entirely. Dad, you can't be serious. Over one disagreement about business advice. This isn't about one disagreement, Claire. This is about 8 years of resistance. 8 years of making Victoria feel like an outsider in her own family. 8 years of your mother's ghost, standing between us and moving forward as a real family unit. The mention of my mother felt like a physical blow. Victoria had spent years subtly competing with a dead woman, gradually removing Mom's photos from prominent places in the house, redecorating rooms to erase her influence, and apparently convincing my father that my loyalty to my mother's memory was somehow an attack on his new marriage. Don't bring Mom into this, I said, my voice shaking for the first time. Your mother is gone, Claire. She's been gone for 11 years, and it's time you accepted that Victoria is the woman in my life now. The woman who's been there through my heart attack, who's helped me build the construction business into something profitable, who's created a loving home for all of us. All of us except me, apparently. You've excluded yourself, Claire. We're just making it official. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, seeing a stranger looking back at me. The Claire in the reflection looked successful, confident, put together, everything I'd worked so hard to become. But inside, I felt like the 11-year-old girl who'd held her mother's hand during those final weeks in the hospital, promising to take care of Dad and make Mom proud. How long? I asked quietly. How long what? How long is this punishment supposed to last? It's not a punishment, Claire. It's a natural consequence. When you're ready to apologize to Victoria and commit to being a real member of this family, we can revisit the relationship. I closed my eyes and made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. Instead of begging, instead of apologizing for crimes I didn't believe I'd committed, instead of accepting their narrative about my character and behavior, I chose dignity. I understand, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I hope someday you'll realize what you're throwing away, but I understand. Claire, wait. For just a moment, my father's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he'd expected more of a fight. Tell Kevin and Natalie I love them, and I hope they have good lives. Goodbye, Dad. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my office, surrounded by the presentation materials for tomorrow's career-defining meeting. Outside, Seattle's city lights sparkled like stars, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely alone in the universe. The next morning, I walked into that boardroom and delivered the presentation of my lifetime. I landed the client, secured the contract that would make my company profitable, and began building the empire that would eventually make me wealthy enough to save or destroy the family that had abandoned me. But that night, calling Marcus to share the good news, I realized I had no family to celebrate with.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
For the first time since my mother's death, I cried, not from sadness, but from a grief so pure it felt like losing her all over again. What I didn't know then was that Victoria had orchestrated the entire confrontation, timing it perfectly to coincide with my biggest professional moment, ensuring that my triumph would be forever tainted by their rejection. She'd played a long game, gradually poisoning my relationship with my father over 8 years, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate the only obstacle standing between her children and their inheritance. What she also didn't know was that her perfect plan would eventually backfire in ways she never could have imagined, and that the daughter she'd successfully exiled would become the only person capable of saving the family she'd fought so hard to control. 10 years later, when desperation stripped away her facade and forced her to dial my number, Victoria would discover that some games have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victory. She would learn that the quiet, respectful daughter she'd dismissed as weak had inherited more than just her mother's eyes. She'd inherited her father's business instincts, her mother's steel core, and a decade of motivation to prove exactly how wrong they'd all been about her. But that phone call was still years away, and first, I had to survive the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about love, family, and belonging. I had to learn to build a life from scratch, with no safety net except my own determination, and no family except the one I would eventually create for myself. The morning after that call, I deleted my father's number from my phone, boxed up every family photo in my apartment, and began the process of becoming someone entirely new. Someone who didn't need their approval, their love, or their acceptance to be complete. I had no way of knowing that this metamorphosis would eventually make me powerful enough to hold their entire future in my hands, or that the daughter they'd taught to be invisible would someday become impossible to ignore. The journey from that broken-hearted 28-year-old to the woman who could casually decide the fate of the Donovan family legacy began with a single choice. I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small, unwanted, or expendable. I would build something so substantial, so undeniably valuable, that their opinion of my worth would become irrelevant. What I built was more than a business or a fortune. I built a version of myself that could survive anything, including the moment when the people who'd thrown me away would desperately need me to save them from the consequences of their own choices. That moment was coming, though neither of us knew it yet. Victoria's phone call was still 8 years in the future, and I had a lot of growing to do before I would be ready to face the family that had taught me my first lesson in power. Sometimes the only way to win the game is to refuse to play by their rules. The years before that devastating phone call had been a masterclass in psychological manipulation, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Victoria Sterling entered our lives, like a gentle spring rain, after a harsh winter, appearing at my father's construction office with a legitimate real estate inquiry, just 14 months after my mother's funeral. She needed an estimate for renovating a property she'd inherited from her ex-husband's estate, she explained, and several people had recommended Donovan Construction for quality work. I was 21 then, home from the University of Oregon for summer break, and working part-time in Dad's office to help with the administrative backlog that had accumulated during his grief-stricken months. My mother had been the unofficial bookkeeper for the business, handling invoices and client communications from our kitchen table every evening after her day job at the school district. After her death, Dad had struggled to maintain both the construction work and the paperwork, often letting bills pile up and missing follow-up calls with potential clients. Victoria appeared on a Thursday afternoon in July, wearing a tailored navy dress that struck the perfect balance between professional and approachable. She had honey-colored hair that caught the light beautifully, green eyes that seemed genuinely interested in everything Dad said, and a way of asking questions that made him feel like an expert rather than a contractor being evaluated. I watched from my desk near the window as Dad showed her samples of his work, his voice more animated than I'd heard it in months. She complimented the craftsmanship in photos of our renovated kitchens, asked thoughtful questions about materials and timelines, and somehow managed to mention that she was recently divorced and finding it challenging to navigate home maintenance decisions alone. By the end of their meeting, Dad had not only provided a detailed estimate for her renovation, but had also offered to personally oversee the project to ensure everything met her standards. Over the following weeks, Victoria found reasons to visit the office frequently. Sometimes she had questions about the renovation progress, sometimes she brought coffee and pastries for the crew, and occasionally she arrived with lunch for Dad, claiming she'd ordered too much food and didn't want it to go to waste. Her presence transformed the atmosphere of the office, bringing warmth and efficiency that had been missing since Mom's death. I appreciated what she was doing for Dad's spirits, though something about her felt performative in a way I couldn't articulate. She remembered everyone's names, asked about their families, and had a gift for making each person feel special and valued. The construction crew adored her, often lingering after completing work at her property to chat or accept her offers of cold drinks and homemade cookies. The renovation project stretched longer than necessary, with Victoria requesting additional work and modifications that kept Dad's crew busy at her house for nearly 4 months. During this time, she began inviting Dad for dinner to discuss project details, insisting it was more civilized than meeting at the dusty construction site. These dinners gradually became more social, and soon Dad was spending 2 or 3 evenings a week at Victoria's beautifully appointed home in Lake Oswego. I met Kevin and Natalie during one of these dinners, when Victoria insisted Dad bring me along to meet her children. Kevin was 15 then, a quiet boy who seemed uncomfortable with the attention his mother demanded he show my father. He was polite but distant, answering questions with minimal responses and disappearing to his room as soon as Victoria allowed it. Natalie, 13, was more forthcoming but in a calculated way that reminded me of her mother. She complimented my outfit, asked about my college experiences, and made a point of mentioning how much happier her mother seemed since meeting my father. Victoria had created a home that felt like a magazine spread, with neutral colors, fresh flowers, and the kind of strategic lighting that made everyone look their best. The dinner conversation flowed smoothly, covering safe topics like current events, local restaurants, and Kevin's upcoming sophomore year of high school. Victoria proved to be an excellent cook, presenting courses that were both delicious and beautifully plated, and she had a talent for drawing people into conversation without making it feel forced. After dinner, as Victoria served coffee and a dessert she'd made from scratch, she began asking about my mother with what seemed like genuine interest and sensitivity. She wanted to know about Mom's personality, her interests, her role in the family and the business. Her questions felt respectful rather than intrusive, and Dad seemed grateful to have someone who wanted to understand the woman he'd lost rather than simply replace her. This became Victoria's signature approach over the following months. She never positioned herself as a replacement for my mother, but rather as someone who honored Mom's memory while bringing her own gifts to our family. She listened to Dad's stories about their early years together, looked through photo albums with appropriate reverence, and even suggested creating a memory garden in our backyard using some of Mom's favorite flowers. The courtship progressed with the kind of steady inevitability that made objections seem petty. Victoria was thoughtful, reliable, and clearly devoted to making Dad happy. She integrated herself into his routine gradually, taking over tasks he'd been struggling with since Mom's death. She organized his paperwork, updated his client database, and even redesigned his business cards with a more professional look that immediately impressed potential customers. When Dad started bringing Victoria to family gatherings and community events, people consistently commented on how lucky he was to find someone so compatible. Victoria had a gift for making others comfortable, remembering details about their lives and following up on conversations weeks later. She volunteered for the same charity organizations Mom had supported, joined the same book club, and even attended the same church, though she'd apparently been exploring different denominations since her divorce. The engagement came 18 months after they'd met, announced at a family barbecue Victoria had organized at our house. She'd spent weeks planning the event, coordinating with Dad's siblings and longtime friends to create a celebration that felt both festive and intimate. The proposal itself happened during the party, with Dad making a speech about second chances, and Victoria tearfully accepting while everyone applauded. I felt genuinely happy for Dad that evening, watching him smile and laugh in ways he hadn't since before Mom's illness. Victoria had clearly brought joy back into his life, and her children seemed to be adjusting well to the prospect of joining our family. Kevin had grown more comfortable around Dad over the months, often asking for help with homework or advice about cars. Natalie had begun referring to our house as home, and talking excitedly about having a big sister when the families merged. The wedding planning revealed the first glimpses of Victoria's more controlling tendencies, though she framed them as preferences born from experience. She'd been married before, she explained, and had learned from the mistakes of her first wedding. This time she wanted everything to reflect their mature approach to marriage and their blended family's new beginning. Victoria selected the venue, a historic mansion in Portland's West Hills, that she felt would photograph beautifully and accommodate both families comfortably. She chose the menu, the flowers, the music, and even suggested appropriate attire for family members, claiming she wanted everyone to look coordinated in the photos. When I suggested including some elements that honored my mother's memory, Victoria agreed enthusiastically, but somehow those suggestions never made it into the final plans due to various logistical complications. The guest list became a source of ongoing tension, though Victoria managed to present her preferences as practical considerations rather than personal desires. Several of Dad's longtime friends were subtly excluded because Victoria felt their presence might create awkward dynamics given their close relationships with my mother. Some family traditions were modified to accommodate Victoria's children's comfort levels, and gradually the wedding began to feel more like Victoria's vision of what our new family should be rather than a celebration of Dad's happiness. I raised gentle objections to some of these changes, but Victoria had a talent for making my concerns seem selfish or insensitive. When I questioned the elimination of certain traditions, she reminded me that Kevin and Natalie were already struggling to adjust to major changes, and needed to feel included rather than reminded of their outsider status. When I suggested incorporating more of Dad's preferences, she pointed out that he was still processing grief, and might not be thinking clearly about what would actually make him happy long term. The wedding itself was beautiful, elegant, and perfectly executed. Victoria looked radiant in a sophisticated cream-colored dress that photographed beautifully without competing with traditional bridal imagery. Dad seemed genuinely happy, giving a heartfelt speech about finding love again when he'd thought that chapter of his life was over. Kevin and Natalie participated in the ceremony as junior attendants, symbolically joining our families together. But during the reception, I began to notice the subtle ways Victoria managed interactions and conversations. She had a gift for redirecting attention when discussions turned to topics she preferred to avoid, smoothly changing subjects when guests shared memories of my mother, and positioning herself at the center of family photos in ways that seemed natural but effectively minimized others' presence. The honeymoon period after their marriage lasted about 6 months, during which Victoria focused on merging our households and establishing new family routines. She moved into our family home, bringing furniture and decorative items that gradually replaced much of what Mom had chosen. The changes were presented as updates and improvements rather than erasures, with Victoria explaining that blending families required creating new spaces that belonged to everyone rather than preserving shrines to the past. Victoria proved to be an excellent stepmother in many observable ways. She attended Kevin and Natalie's school events, helped with homework, and maintained consistent rules and expectations. She cooked family dinners most nights, kept the house immaculately organized, and created holiday traditions that included elements from both families' backgrounds. Dad's business thrived under her administrative influence, as she brought professional organizational skills and a marketing sensibility that attracted higher-end clients. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamics of our family conversations began to shift. Victoria had opinions about everything, and a persuasive way of presenting them that made disagreement seem unreasonable. She believed Kevin would benefit from private school and convinced Dad that the investment would pay dividends in his future opportunities. She thought Natalie showed talent in dance and enrolled her in expensive classes that required significant time commitments from the family. She felt the family needed a larger, more impressive home, and began house hunting in Lake Oswego's most prestigious neighborhoods. Each of these decisions was presented logically, with Victoria providing research and cost-benefit analyses that supported her preferences. She never demanded anything outright, but rather created conditions where her preferred outcome seemed like the obvious choice. When Dad expressed concerns about costs, Victoria reminded him of the increased business income her organizational improvements had generated. When I questioned whether such major changes were necessary, Victoria suggested I might be having difficulty adjusting to the family's evolution, and offered to help me work through my resistance. The move to Lake Oswego happened during my senior year at the University of Oregon, timed so that I wouldn't be disrupted during a crucial academic period. Victoria found a stunning Tudor-style home with 5 bedrooms, extensive gardens, and enough space for Dad's growing business to have a proper home office. The house was undeniably beautiful and represented the kind of success Dad had worked toward his entire career. But the new house also meant leaving the neighborhood where I'd grown up, the home where my mother had lived and died, and the community connections that had sustained our family through difficult times. Victoria presented the move as a fresh start for everyone, an opportunity to create new memories in a space designed around our blended family's current needs, rather than our individual histories. My bedroom in the new house was lovely, decorated in colors Victoria had chosen based on her assessment of my personality and preferences. She'd included thoughtful touches like a reading nook with good lighting and built-in shelves for my books. But it felt like a guest room in someone else's home, rather than a space that belonged to me, and I found myself spending most of my visits home in common areas, rather than retreating to what was supposedly my private space. The subtle changes in family dynamics became more pronounced after the move. Victoria hosted dinner parties and social gatherings that showcased their beautiful home and successful marriage, but the guest lists rarely included people who had been close to my mother. Family photos displayed throughout the house featured Victoria's carefully curated selection of images, with earlier family pictures relegated to less prominent locations or packed away entirely. Kevin and Natalie thrived in their new environment, adjusting to private schools and extracurricular activities that positioned them for future success. Victoria's investment in their development was paying obvious dividends, with Kevin excelling academically and earning recognition in debate competitions, while Natalie's dance training led to roles in local productions. They seemed genuinely happy and grateful for the opportunities Victoria had created for them. But I began to feel increasingly displaced in this new version of our family. Conversations revolved around topics and people I knew little about, with Victoria and her children sharing inside jokes and references that excluded me. Family traditions we'd maintained since my childhood were gradually replaced with new customs that reflected Victoria's preferences and her children's interests. Even Dad seemed different in this environment, more concerned with appearances and less comfortable with the casual spontaneity that had characterized our relationship before. When I graduated from college and announced my plans to move to Seattle for a position with a tech consulting firm, Victoria was enthusiastically supportive. She helped me research neighborhoods, provided advice about professional wardrobe choices, and even offered to help with moving expenses. Her support felt genuine and generous, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she was also relieved to have me settled at a comfortable distance from the family's daily life. The pattern of subtle exclusion continued during my visits home over the following years. Family dinners were scheduled around Kevin's debate tournaments and Natalie's dance recitals, with my presence appreciated, but not essential to the family's rhythm. Victoria would update me on everyone's activities and accomplishments, making me feel included in the family's narrative, while simultaneously highlighting how separate my life had become from theirs. Victoria's influence over Dad's business decisions also expanded during this period, with her suggestions consistently leading to increased profits and improved client relationships. She encouraged him to pursue commercial projects rather than residential renovations, arguing that corporate clients offered better long-term stability and higher profit margins. Under her guidance, Donovan Construction evolved from a small family business into a legitimate competitor in Portland's commercial development market. This success allowed Victoria to justify her opinions about family finances and future planning with concrete evidence of her business acumen. When she suggested that Dad establish college funds for Kevin and Natalie, the money was readily available. When she recommended upgrading their home's landscaping and security systems, the improvements were easily affordable. When she proposed family vacations to destinations that would provide educational opportunities for the children, Dad eagerly agreed. But Victoria's financial advice regarding my career and life choices often seemed designed to highlight my independence rather than support my integration into the family's success. She praised my decision to build my own business rather than joining Dad's company, noting that I clearly had the entrepreneurial spirit to succeed without family assistance. She admired my choice to rent rather than buy property in Seattle, observing that flexibility was valuable for someone in my position. She respected my decision to focus on career development rather than settling down, commenting that I seemed to prioritize professional achievement over personal relationships. These observations weren't criticisms exactly, but they created a narrative about my character and priorities that justified treating me differently than Kevin and Natalie. I was the independent one who didn't need family support, while they were the children who benefited from family investment and guidance. I was the career-focused daughter who valued autonomy over intimacy, while they were the family members who contributed to household harmony and shared experiences. The financial crisis that would eventually destroy Victoria's carefully constructed empire was already brewing during these years, though none of us recognized the warning signs. Dad's expansion into commercial development required significant capital investments and longer payment cycles than residential work. Victoria encouraged him to leverage their personal assets to fund business growth, arguing that the real estate market's steady appreciation made their home equity an underutilized resource. They refinanced the Lake Oswego house multiple times, using the proceeds to purchase equipment, hire additional staff, and secure materials for increasingly ambitious projects. Victoria's background in real estate gave her confidence in property values that seemed justified by Portland's booming development market. Each refinancing was presented as a strategic business decision that would accelerate the company's growth and secure the family's long-term financial stability. But the projects that looked so promising on paper began experiencing delays, cost overruns, and client disputes that ate into profit margins. The commercial clients Victoria had encouraged Dad to pursue proved more demanding and less reliable than the residential customers who had sustained the business for decades. Payment schedules stretched longer than anticipated, while the fixed costs of expanded operations continued regardless of revenue fluctuations. Victoria responded to these challenges by doubling down on growth strategies, convincing Dad that temporary cash flow problems were normal for expanding businesses, and that retreat would signal weakness to competitors. She researched additional financing options, negotiated extended payment terms with suppliers, and even suggested that Kevin and Natalie's college funds could be temporarily borrowed against to maintain business operations during the transition period. The house became a symbol of their success and a financial instrument for sustaining it, with Victoria treating its appreciating value as a renewable resource, rather than recognizing it as their family's fundamental security. Each time they extracted equity, Victoria presented detailed projections, showing how the investment would generate returns that exceeded the borrowing costs. Her confidence was infectious, and Dad trusted her business instincts based on the success they'd achieved together. During my visits home during this period, I noticed signs of financial stress that Victoria quickly explained away. The landscaping company they'd used for years was replaced with a less expensive service because Victoria wanted to try new approaches to garden design. Some of the artwork and decorative items that had made their home so impressive disappeared because Victoria was redecorating to reflect evolving tastes. Kevin's private school tuition was switched to a monthly payment plan because Victoria felt it provided better cash flow management. None of these changes seemed alarming individually, and Victoria's explanations were always reasonable and well considered. She had a gift for framing financial adjustments as strategic choices rather than desperate measures, maintaining the appearance of prosperity even as the foundation of their security was gradually eroding. The psychological manipulation that had been subtle during the early years of their marriage became more systematic as financial pressures mounted. Victoria began creating situations where family members had to choose sides in minor disagreements, testing loyalties, and identifying potential threats to her influence. She developed a talent for reframing other people's concerns as personal character flaws, making it difficult to raise objections without seeming petty or disloyal. When I questioned some of their financial decisions during family visits, Victoria would listen thoughtfully and then explain why my concerns, while understandable from my perspective, didn't account for factors I wasn't aware of. She would acknowledge my intelligence and good intentions, while making it clear that my distance from the family's daily reality limited my understanding of their situation. Dad would nod along with these explanations, trusting Victoria's assessment of both the financial facts and my motivations for questioning them. This pattern of patient dismissal extended to other family interactions as well. When I suggested activities or traditions that had been meaningful to our family before Victoria's arrival, she would consider them carefully, and then explain why they might not work, given the family's current dynamics or schedule. When I offered to help with Kevin and Natalie's college preparation or career planning, Victoria would appreciate my interest, while noting that she'd already researched the best approaches and had everything under control. The message was always delivered kindly but firmly. I was a beloved family member, whose opinions were valued, but whose actual participation in family decisions was unnecessary and potentially disruptive. Victoria had created a system where Dad depended on her judgment, Kevin and Natalie looked to her for guidance, and my role was limited to supportive observer of the family's success. This carefully orchestrated marginalization accelerated as my own business began to thrive in Seattle. Victoria seemed genuinely proud of my achievements, often bragging to her friends about her successful stepdaughter, who was building a consulting empire in the tech industry. But she also used my success to justify treating me differently than Kevin and Natalie, arguing that someone of my capabilities clearly didn't need the same level of family support and involvement that her younger children required. The irony was that as I became more financially successful and professionally independent, I found myself feeling more emotionally isolated from the family I'd grown up, believing would always be my foundation. Victoria's masterful manipulation had created conditions where my strength became evidence of my separateness, and my success became justification for my exclusion. By the time Victoria orchestrated the final confrontation that would sever my relationship with Dad entirely, she'd spent 8 years conditioning him to see me as the problem, rather than recognizing her systematic campaign to eliminate my influence over the family's future. She'd positioned herself as the victim of my resistance, and Dad as the hero, who would finally stand up for his wife's rightful place in their shared life. The trap was so perfectly constructed that Dad genuinely believed he was protecting his marriage and teaching me valuable lessons about respect and family loyalty. Victoria had convinced him that cutting me off was an act of love that would eventually lead to my spiritual growth and our family's healing. She'd made him complicit in his own daughter's exile, while believing he was doing the right thing for everyone involved. What Victoria couldn't anticipate was that her perfect plan would eventually backfire spectacularly, creating the very conditions that would make me powerful enough to hold their entire future in my hands. But that reckoning was still years away, and first I had to survive the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my place in the world. The foundation Victoria had built for my elimination was so comprehensive and psychologically sophisticated that even I didn't fully understand what had happened to me until years later. I only knew that the family I'd loved and trusted had decided I was disposable, and that somehow I needed to build a new life from the wreckage of that devastating revelation. The years immediately following my exile were a blur of professional achievement and personal devastation that I navigated with the kind of determined numbness that follows profound betrayal. Marcus Chen, my business partner, watched me transform from someone who worked hard to someone who worked obsessively, channeling the rage and grief of losing my family into building something that could never be taken away from me. Our consulting firm, Cascade Technical Solutions, thrived in ways that seemed almost surreal given the personal chaos I was experiencing. The client we'd landed the day after Dad's devastating phone call turned out to be the first domino in a series of successes that would eventually make me wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined. When I was crying myself to sleep in my Seattle apartment, mourning the loss of people who were still alive, but had chosen to act as if I were dead, I threw myself into work with an intensity that worried Marcus, though he was wise enough to recognize that my pain was fuel for something extraordinary. I stayed in the office until midnight most nights, developing innovative solutions for clients who'd been struggling with complex technical challenges for months or years. I traveled constantly, taking on projects in different cities and time zones that kept me too busy to dwell on the silence from Portland that had replaced what used to be regular family contact. The first 2 years after the cutoff were a masterclass in compartmentalization. During business hours, I was sharp, focused, and increasingly successful. I negotiated contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, developed proprietary systems that solved previously intractable problems, and built a reputation for being someone who could walk into any organization and identify solutions that others had missed. My professional confidence grew with each success, creating a version of myself that seemed completely unaffected by personal trauma. But nights and weekends were different. I would find myself scrolling through social media, looking for any glimpse of my family's life that Victoria might have allowed to slip through their carefully maintained privacy settings. I learned that Kevin had been accepted to Stanford University when a mutual family friend posted congratulations that mentioned his full scholarship for academic excellence. I discovered that Natalie had won a regional dance competition when a local newspaper article appeared in my Google alerts for Dad's business. These fragments of information felt like looking at my former life through a telescope, able to observe but never again participate. Victoria had been thorough in her campaign to erase me from their narrative, but occasionally evidence of my existence would surface in ways she couldn't control. Old family friends would mention me in comments on Dad's business posts, asking how I was doing or sharing memories that included me. Victoria never responded to these inquiries, but she couldn't delete them without appearing rude or drawing attention to my absence. 3 years after the cutoff, I hired a private investigator named James Morrison to conduct what I told myself was routine background research for potential business expansion in the Portland market. The truth was more complicated and more painful than I wanted to admit. I needed to know what was happening to my family, even if they'd made it clear they didn't want me to know. James was a retired police detective who specialized in financial investigations, and his initial report on Donovan Construction's business status revealed the first cracks in Victoria's carefully constructed empire. The company was taking on increasingly large projects with tight margins, relying heavily on borrowed capital to fund operations between client payments. Their Lake Oswego home had been refinanced multiple times, with the latest mortgage representing nearly 90% of the property's assessed value. But the most revealing information came from public records that showed Victoria's pattern of financial decision-making over the previous 5 years. She had convinced Dad to consolidate all their assets under joint ownership, giving her legal access to everything they'd built together while effectively eliminating any financial independence he might have maintained. Their business credit lines were secured against personal assets, meaning that any significant setback in the construction business would immediately threaten their home and savings. James's investigation also revealed that Victoria had been researching bankruptcy attorneys and asset protection strategies, suggesting she was aware of the precarious nature of their situation, even while continuing to make decisions that increased their risk exposure. Her internet search history, obtained through methods James diplomatically described as comprehensive, showed queries about transferring assets to adult children, moving funds to offshore accounts, and shielding personal wealth from business creditors. The picture that emerged was of someone who had used my father's business success and personal trust to construct an increasingly unstable financial structure that could collapse at any moment. Victoria had leveraged their property, expanded their debt, and committed them to projects they couldn't afford to complete while simultaneously researching ways to protect herself when the inevitable crash occurred. But the most devastating revelation came in James's supplemental report 6 months later, when his ongoing monitoring of the family's activities uncovered the truth about why Victoria had been so determined to eliminate me from their lives. Her research hadn't been limited to bankruptcy protection and asset preservation. She'd also been investigating Oregon's inheritance laws, particularly the rights of biological children versus stepchildren in cases where parents die without comprehensive estate planning. Under Oregon law, if Dad died intestate, I would be entitled to a significant portion of his estate regardless of Victoria's wishes or their marriage duration. My biological relationship to him created legal claims that couldn't be dissolved through remarriage or adoption of stepchildren. The only way to ensure that Kevin and Natalie would inherit everything Victoria believed they deserved was to either convince Dad to explicitly disinherit me in a legally binding will, or to create conditions where I would voluntarily relinquish any claim to his legacy. Victoria's 8-year campaign to marginalize me hadn't been driven by personal animosity or even jealousy of my relationship with Dad. It had been a calculated strategy to protect the inheritance she was planning for her biological children. By convincing Dad to cut off contact with me completely, she'd created a narrative that would support his decision to leave me nothing while appearing to protect a loving stepmother and her deserving children from the influence of an ungrateful daughter. The private investigator's findings revealed that Victoria had consulted with estate planning attorneys about the most effective ways to disinherit adult children, researched the legal requirements for proving parental abandonment or abuse that would justify such decisions, and even explored the possibility of having me declared legally estranged in ways that would strengthen their case if I ever contested Dad's will. Her manipulation had been so sophisticated because it wasn't motivated by emotion but by strategy. Every slight, every exclusion, every carefully orchestrated confrontation had been designed to build a legal and emotional case for my elimination from the family's future. Victoria hadn't just wanted me gone from their daily lives, she'd wanted me erased from their legacy entirely. Reading James's reports in my Seattle office, surrounded by the evidence of the empire I'd built while they'd been planning my permanent exile, I felt something shift inside me that was deeper and colder than anger. For 3 years I'd been grieving the loss of my family's love, torturing myself with questions about what I'd done wrong and how I could have been a better daughter. Now I understood that no amount of accommodation or improvement on my part would have changed the outcome, because Victoria's goals had never been about family harmony or personal growth. She had identified me as an obstacle to her children's financial future, and had systematically worked to eliminate that obstacle using my father's love and trust as weapons against me. The confrontation that had ended our relationship hadn't been the result of accumulated disappointments or fundamental incompatibilities. It had been the culmination of a deliberate campaign to position me as the villain in a story that would justify my complete disinheritance. The revelation recontextualized every interaction I'd had with Victoria over the 8 years of her marriage to Dad. Her suggestions that I focus on career independence rather than family involvement hadn't been supportive advice, they'd been strategic moves to establish my separateness from the family unit. Her praise for my self-reliance hadn't been admiration for my strength, it had been documentation of my ability to survive without family support that could be used to justify cutting me off entirely. Even her apparent kindness toward me in the early years took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of long-term strategy. Victoria had needed to establish herself as someone who'd tried to build a relationship with me before documenting my supposed resistance and ingratitude. She'd created a paper trail of overtures and rejections that would support her narrative about my character and justify Dad's eventual decision to choose his wife's children over his biological daughter. The sophistication of her manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty and effectiveness. Victoria had spent 8 years conditioning Dad to see our relationship through her interpretation of my behavior, gradually shifting his perception of my independence from a source of pride to evidence of rejection. She'd reframed my success as proof that I didn't need family support, my geographic distance as emotional unavailability, and my occasional disagreements with her suggestions as fundamental disrespect for his marriage. But Victoria's masterful plan contained a flaw she hadn't anticipated. By forcing me to build a life entirely independent of family support or connection, she'd inadvertently created someone with the resources and motivation to eventually threaten everything she'd worked to protect. The daughter she'd successfully eliminated from Dad's emotional life had used the pain of that rejection to fuel achievements that would eventually make me more powerful than the family that had discarded me. I spent weeks absorbing the implications of James's investigation, trying to process the difference between the grief I'd been carrying and the reality of what had actually happened to me. The mourning I'd been doing was for a family that had never existed, at least not during the Victoria era. The father I'd been missing was someone who'd been systematically turned against me by a woman who'd viewed me as a financial threat rather than a daughter. But understanding Victoria's motivations also revealed something else. The precarious nature of everything she'd built her strategy around. Her plans for Kevin and Natalie's inheritance were predicated on Dad's business success and the continued appreciation of assets that were increasingly leveraged beyond reasonable limits. The empire she'd convinced him to build was becoming more fragile each year, supported by debt and speculation rather than sustainable growth. If Donovan construction failed, if the real estate market declined, if any of the major projects they'd committed to experienced significant cost overruns, the inheritance Victoria had been planning for her children would evaporate along with the family's financial stability. She'd been so focused on eliminating my claim to Dad's legacy that she'd failed to preserve the substance of that legacy for anyone. This realization led to a shift in my emotional relationship with the family's rejection. Instead of viewing myself as the victim of their decision, I began to see myself as someone who'd been saved from association with their increasingly reckless financial behavior. Victoria's campaign to eliminate me from their lives had actually protected me from being dragged down by the consequences of decisions I'd had no part in making. My business continued to thrive while I processed these revelations, with Cascade Technical Solutions expanding into new markets and developing innovative service offerings that set us apart from competitors. Marcus and I hired additional consultants, opened satellite offices in 3 cities, and began licensing our proprietary systems to other firms. The success felt different now that I understood it wasn't just personal achievement but also insurance against ever being vulnerable to other people's manipulations again. I also began making strategic investments in real estate and technology stocks, building wealth that was entirely separate from my business income and diversified across multiple asset classes. The financial independence I was creating went far beyond what I needed for personal security. It was the foundation for influence and power that could be deployed when circumstances warranted it. 5 years after the cutoff, James Morrison's ongoing monitoring of the Donovan family situation revealed that their financial stress was escalating into crisis territory. The construction business was struggling with cost overruns on two major projects, and client payments were arriving months behind schedule. Victoria had convinced Dad to take on additional debt to complete the projects, but the interest payments were consuming most of their monthly cash flow. Kevin had graduated from Stanford with honors and been accepted to law school, but the family was struggling to finance his education despite the academic achievements Victoria had invested so heavily in cultivating. Natalie's dance career was progressing well, but the costs of training, travel, and competition were straining a budget that was already stretched beyond sustainability. Most significantly, the Lake Oswego house that had symbolized their success and served as their primary source of borrowed capital was now worth less than they owed against it. Portland's real estate market had softened, and the luxury home market was particularly vulnerable to economic uncertainty. Victoria and Dad were trapped in a property they couldn't afford to keep but couldn't sell without taking a devastating financial loss. The private investigators' reports painted a picture of a family in free fall, though they were maintaining appearances with the same skill Victoria had always applied to managing perceptions. Their social media presence still projected success and happiness, with carefully curated photos from family vacations and celebrations that had likely been funded with credit rather than available cash. But public records told a different story, revealing missed payments, extended deadlines, and increasingly desperate financial maneuvering. Victoria was liquidating personal assets to maintain business operations, selling jewelry and artwork that had once decorated their beautiful home. She'd also been researching legal options for protecting retirement accounts and life insurance policies from business creditors, suggesting she was preparing for the possibility of bankruptcy while trying to preserve some resources for their future. The most telling development was Victoria's renewed interest in estate planning, with recent consultations focusing not on inheritance strategies but on debt forgiveness and asset protection for surviving spouses. She was apparently concerned that Dad's health couldn't withstand the stress of their financial situation, and she was positioning herself to survive the collapse of everything they'd built together. Reading these reports, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I hadn't expected. There was satisfaction in seeing Victoria's careful plans crumbling under the weight of their own contradictions, but there was also genuine sadness for Dad, who trusted someone who had ultimately put his entire legacy at risk. Kevin and Natalie were innocent victims of their mother's miscalculations, facing the loss of opportunities and security they'd done nothing to jeopardize. Most surprisingly, I realized I felt nothing resembling vindication or revenge. The family that had rejected me was destroying itself through choices I'd had no part in, and their suffering brought me no joy. If anything, I felt a kind of detached pity for people who'd been so focused on acquiring and protecting wealth that they'd failed to recognize the difference between financial success and actual security. But I also recognized that their crisis was creating an opportunity I hadn't anticipated when I'd first hired James to investigate their situation. Victoria had eliminated me from their family in order to protect an inheritance that was now evaporating through her own financial mismanagement. The daughter she'd viewed as a threat to her children's future was now in a position to potentially save or destroy what remained of that future. The power dynamic that Victoria had worked so hard to manipulate in her favor had completely reversed, though she didn't know it yet. The family that had taught me I was disposable was about to discover that I'd become indispensable, and that the daughter they'd discarded might be the only person capable of saving them from the consequences of their own choices. 7 years after that devastating phone call from Dad, I received an unexpected visitor at my Seattle office. Patricia Hoffman, the family attorney who had handled my parents' estate planning when I was still considered part of the family, requested a meeting to discuss what she diplomatically described as a sensitive matter involving the Donovan estate. Patricia was a woman in her 60s with silver hair, and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she'd seen every possible family drama unfold in her conference room. She'd known my mother well, had handled the legal aspects of Mom's final illness, and had been present for many of the family meetings that had shaped my childhood understanding of responsibility and legacy. She arrived at Cascade Technical Solutions on a Wednesday afternoon, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that projected both authority and discretion. My assistant showed her into the conference room overlooking Elliott Bay, where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the water and mountains that had become the backdrop for my new life. "Claire, you look wonderful," Patricia said as she settled into her chair, her tone carrying genuine warmth mixed with professional caution. "I've been following your business success through the local papers. Your mother would be so proud of what you've accomplished." The mention of my mother created an immediate tension in the room, given Patricia's obvious knowledge of my family's current situation and her reason for being there. I offered coffee, which she accepted, using the brief interruption to study my face as if trying to assess my emotional state and potential receptiveness to whatever proposal she'd come to make. "I assume this isn't a social visit," I said, once we'd both settled with our coffee. "What brings you to Seattle, Patricia?" She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder that she placed on the table between us without immediately opening it. "Your father asked me to reach out to you. He's facing some significant challenges, and he's hoping to re-establish communication." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I'd thought was completely extinguished. For 7 years I'd heard nothing from Dad except occasional second-hand reports through James Morrison's investigations. The silence had been complete and absolute, exactly what Victoria had demanded when she'd convinced him to cut me off entirely. "My father hasn't spoken to me in 7 years," I said carefully. "What's changed?" Patricia's expression shifted into the careful neutrality that lawyers use when delivering news that's both significant and potentially volatile. "Robert is very ill, Claire. He's been diagnosed with advanced heart disease, and his doctors aren't optimistic about his long-term prognosis. The stress of recent business challenges has aggravated his condition considerably." I felt something crack inside my chest, though I couldn't tell if it was renewed grief or the protective numbness I'd built around any thoughts of Dad. The man who had raised me, taught me to drive, walked me through my first heartbreak, and then completely abandoned me was apparently dying, and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel about that information. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But I'm not sure what that has to do with me. Dad made it very clear 7 years ago that I wasn't part of his family anymore." Patricia leaned forward slightly, her lawyer instincts recognizing the careful control in my response. "Claire, your father regrets how things ended between you. He's asked me to arrange a meeting so he can apologize and hopefully rebuild your relationship before it's too late." "Victoria agreed to this?" I asked, knowing that Dad's wife would never voluntarily relinquish control over family communications or allow my reintegration into their lives. The slight pause before Patricia answered told me everything I needed to know about the family's current power dynamics. "Victoria is facing her own challenges right now. The business is in serious financial trouble, and they're at risk of losing everything they've worked to build. She's no longer in a position to dictate the terms of Robert's personal relationships." There it was, laid out with the kind of diplomatic honesty that only came from someone who'd witnessed the entire arc of family destruction. Victoria's empire was crumbling, her control over Dad was weakening, and they were desperate enough to reach out to the daughter they'd discarded when they thought they didn't need me. "What exactly are they hoping I'll do?" I asked. Patricia opened the folder and withdrew several documents that she spread across the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd prepared thoroughly for this conversation. "Donovan Construction is facing bankruptcy unless they can secure emergency funding within the next 60 days. They've exhausted their credit options, and the banks won't extend additional loans given their current debt-to-asset ratios." I studied the financial statements she'd provided, recognizing the cascade of poor decisions and over-leveraging that James Morrison had been documenting for years. The numbers were even worse than my private investigators' reports had suggested, with the company owing nearly $3 million to various creditors, while holding assets worth less than half that amount. "The Lake Oswego house is scheduled for foreclosure next month," Patricia continued. "They've missed 4 mortgage payments, and the lender isn't willing to negotiate further modifications. Kevin's law school tuition is past due, and Natalie's dance program has suspended her enrollment until their account is current." Each revelation felt like watching a slow-motion car accident involving people I'd once loved. Victoria's financial manipulations had created a disaster that was consuming everything Dad had worked to build over decades, and now they were hoping I would rescue them from the consequences of decisions I'd been deliberately excluded from. "Why should I care about any of this?" I asked, though my tone was more curious than hostile. "These are the people who told me I wasn't family anymore. They made their choices without consulting me, and now they want me to fix the results. Patricia nodded, acknowledging the reasonable anger in my response. I understand your feelings, Claire, and I think they're completely justified. But I'm not here just as their attorney. I'm here as someone who knew your mother, who was present when she made you promise to take care of your father, and who believes she wouldn't want you to let him lose everything because of pride on either side. The invocation of my mother's memory was a low blow, though I suspected Patricia was genuinely motivated by her own relationship with Mom, rather than any manipulation from Victoria. My mother had indeed made me promise to look after Dad during her final days, though I doubt she'd envisioned circumstances where that promise would require saving him from his wife's financial schemes. What exactly are they asking for? I said finally. Robert would like to meet with you to discuss the possibility of a business partnership or loan arrangement that could help stabilize Donovan Construction. He's prepared to offer you significant equity in the company in exchange for the capital injection needed to prevent bankruptcy. I almost laughed at the audacity of the proposal. The family that had cut me off for being financially irresponsible now wanted me to invest in a company they'd driven to the brink of collapse through their own reckless decisions. They were offering me a partnership in a business that was worth less than its debts as payment for rescuing them from bankruptcy. Does Victoria know about this offer? I asked. Patricia's hesitation answered the question before her words did. Victoria is aware that Robert wants to re-establish contact with you, but they haven't discussed the specific terms of any potential business arrangement. She's been focused on liquidating personal assets to keep the company operational while Robert explores other options. Translation: Dad was making desperate moves behind Victoria's back, probably recognizing that her financial management had created their current crisis. The woman who'd spent 8 years positioning herself as the family's business mastermind was apparently no longer trusted to solve the problems she'd created. I'll consider meeting with him, I said finally, but not at the house and not with Victoria present. If Dad wants to talk to me, it needs to be just the two of us, somewhere neutral. Patricia nodded, making notes in the margins of her documents. I think that can be arranged. Robert is usually in Portland on Wednesdays for medical appointments. We could meet at my office if that would be comfortable for you. I'll let you know, I said, closing the folder without committing to anything specific. Give me a few days to think about it. After Patricia left, I sat in my conference room for nearly an hour, watching the afternoon light shift across Elliott Bay while processing the implications of everything she'd told me. The family that had rejected me was collapsing under the weight of Victoria's ambitions, and Dad was apparently sick enough that he was willing to defy his wife to try to reconnect with me before he died. But the timing of his outreach felt less like genuine remorse and more like practical desperation. 7 years of silence had been broken not by love or regret, but by the need for money that only I was in a position to provide. If Donovan Construction had been thriving, if the house hadn't been facing foreclosure, if Victoria's plans had been working, would Dad have ever tried to contact me at all? I called James Morrison that evening and asked him to accelerate his monitoring of the family's situation. Within a week, he'd provided a comprehensive update that confirmed Patricia's assessment while revealing additional details that painted an even grimmer picture of their circumstances. Victoria had been borrowing against Kevin's Stanford student loans to make mortgage payments, effectively stealing from her son's educational future to maintain the appearance of solvency. She'd also cashed out Dad's life insurance policies, using the money to pay contractor bills while leaving the family with no financial protection if his health deteriorated further. Most troubling, she'd been moving money into accounts under her name alone, apparently preparing to protect whatever assets she could if Dad died and left her to deal with the business debts independently. The pattern of financial manipulation that had begun with eliminating me from the family's future had evolved into something that threatened everyone's security, including the children Victoria claimed to be protecting. Her strategies for preserving wealth had become a systematic destruction of wealth, with each desperate measure creating new vulnerabilities and dependencies. James also discovered that Victoria had been researching Dad's medical prognosis, consulting with lawyers about widows' rights, and exploring options for dissolving business partnerships and debts through death or disability clauses. She was apparently planning for Dad's death while simultaneously depending on his continued involvement in solving their financial crisis. Most significantly, James learned that Victoria had been secretly negotiating with potential buyers for Donovan Construction's client list and equipment, preparing to liquidate the business without Dad's knowledge or consent. She was positioning herself to emerge from their financial collapse with whatever assets she could protect, even if it meant completely destroying the company Dad had spent his career building. Armed with this information, I realized that any decision I made about helping my family needed to account for Victoria's continued presence and influence. Even if Dad was genuinely remorseful about our estrangement, even if he was sincere about wanting to rebuild our relationship, he was still married to someone who viewed me as a threat and would work to undermine any reconciliation that didn't serve her interests. But I also recognized that Dad's illness and their financial crisis had created a unique opportunity to address the injustices that had shaped the last 7 years of my life. For the first time since Victoria had convinced him to cut me off, Dad was in a position where he needed me more than he needed to maintain peace with his wife. The balance of power that had always favored Victoria's manipulation was temporarily shifted in a direction that might allow for honest conversation and genuine accountability. 2 weeks after Patricia's visit, I called her office and agreed to meet with Dad the following Wednesday. I specified that the meeting would be limited to 2 hours, that no other family members could be present, and that I wanted a comprehensive financial audit of Donovan Construction's situation before committing to any assistance. Patricia arranged for the meeting to take place in her conference room, with Dad driving down from Portland alone while Victoria presumably remained at home dealing with whatever crisis was most urgent that particular day. I flew down from Seattle on Tuesday evening, staying at a downtown hotel rather than imposing on friends who might feel obligated to ask about my family's situation. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that matched my mood as I walked through the Pearl District toward Patricia's office building. I'd chosen a navy business suit that projected professional authority without appearing confrontational, wanting to look like someone who had options rather than someone desperate for reconciliation. Patricia met me in the lobby, her expression carefully neutral as she guided me toward the elevator. "Robert arrived about 10 minutes ago," she said quietly. "He seems nervous but determined. I think he genuinely wants to make things right with you, Claire." The elevator ride felt endless, though it probably lasted less than a minute. 7 years of silence were about to be broken, and I wasn't sure whether I was hoping for vindication, closure, or simply the opportunity to finally say everything I'd rehearsed in imaginary conversations during sleepless nights. Patricia opened the conference room door, and I saw my father for the first time since that terrible dinner at Victoria's house 8 years earlier. He looked older than I'd expected, thinner and grayer, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well for months. He stood when I entered, his movement careful in a way that spoke to both physical weakness and emotional uncertainty. "Claire," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth I remembered from childhood, though now it was layered with what sounded like genuine regret. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Hello, Dad," I replied, accepting his offered handshake instead of the hug he'd probably been hoping for. "Patricia said you wanted to talk." We settled into chairs across from each other at the polished conference table, with Patricia positioning herself at the head as a neutral facilitator. Dad had brought a folder of his own, presumably containing whatever arguments or evidence he'd prepared to support his request for help. "I owe you an apology," he began, his directness surprising me. "Actually, I owe you several apologies, but I'm not sure where to start or whether there's any way to make up for the mistakes I've made." The words I'd been waiting to hear for 7 years hung in the air between us, though now that they'd finally been spoken, I realized they weren't enough to heal the damage that had been done. An apology couldn't restore the birthdays, holidays, and milestones we'd missed sharing. It couldn't undo the years I'd spent building a life that deliberately excluded the possibility of family support or connection. "Why now, Dad?" I asked. "What's changed after 7 years of silence?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from my childhood when he was struggling with difficult decisions. "I'm dying, Claire, maybe not immediately, but soon enough that I can't pretend there's unlimited time to fix the things I've broken. And I finally realized that cutting you out of our lives didn't protect my marriage, it just made everything worse." The admission carried more weight than I'd expected, suggesting that Dad had been questioning Victoria's influence even before their current crisis forced the issue. But I needed to understand how much he actually knew about what had been done to our relationship and whether he was prepared to take responsibility for his role in it. "Do you understand what really happened between us, Dad? Do you know why Victoria wanted me gone?" His expression shifted from regret to something that looked like shame. "I'm beginning to understand that I was manipulated in ways I didn't recognize at the time. Victoria convinced me that you were rejecting our family, that your independence and success meant you didn't need us or want to be part of what we were building together. And now I realize that your independence was exactly what made you valuable to our family, and that pushing you away was the biggest mistake I've ever made." He opened his folder and withdrew several documents that he spread across the table. "I also realize that Victoria's financial decisions have put everything I've worked for at risk, including Kevin and Natalie's future." The documents included bank statements, loan agreements, and business contracts that painted a comprehensive picture of the family's financial disaster. Dad had clearly been investigating Victoria's management of their affairs, discovering the same patterns of reckless borrowing and asset manipulation that James Morrison had been documenting for years. She spent 8 years convincing me that you were the problem, he continued, his voice heavy with regret. But you were never the problem, Claire. You were the solution I was too blind to recognize. The validation I'd been craving for nearly a decade felt both satisfying and hollow. Dad's recognition of Victoria's manipulation came too late to prevent the damage and too conveniently timed with their need for my financial assistance to feel entirely genuine. But it also represented a shift in his understanding that might make genuine reconciliation possible if we could navigate the practical realities of their current situation. Tell me exactly what you're asking me to do, I said. Dad leaned forward, his businessman instincts taking over as he outlined the scope of their crisis and his proposed solution. Donovan Construction needed an immediate injection of $1.5 million to satisfy creditors and avoid bankruptcy. The Lake Oswego house required $400,000 to bring the mortgage current and prevent foreclosure. Kevin's law school tuition and Natalie's dance program needed another $100,000 to resume their suspended enrollments. In exchange for this emergency funding, Dad was offering me a 50% partnership in Donovan Construction, with complete authority over financial decisions and business strategy going forward. He was also prepared to deed me half ownership of the Lake Oswego house and establish me as the primary beneficiary of whatever remained of his estate after satisfying current debts. The proposal was simultaneously generous and desperate, offering me significant assets in exchange for rescuing him from the consequences of Victoria's financial mismanagement. But it also represented a complete reversal of the power dynamics that had defined our family for the past 8 years, with Dad essentially asking me to become the family's financial guardian while Victoria was reduced to a dependent rather than decision-maker. Does Victoria know about these terms? I asked. Dad's pause was answer enough, but he confirmed my suspicion with painful honesty. Victoria knows I'm meeting with you, and she knows we need help. But she doesn't know the extent of what I'm prepared to offer, and she certainly doesn't know that I've discovered some of the financial decisions she's made without consulting me. Such as, he withdrew another set of documents that detailed Victoria's secret negotiations with potential buyers for the construction company's assets, her movement of funds into personal accounts, and her research into legal strategies for protecting herself from business debts. The evidence painted a picture of someone preparing to abandon the family's shared financial responsibilities while positioning herself to benefit from whatever assets could be preserved. I hired my own investigator last month, Dad admitted. I needed to understand how we'd gotten into such a desperate situation so quickly, and what I discovered about Victoria's activities has been eye-opening. The irony wasn't lost on me that both Dad and I had been using private investigators to uncover the truth about Victoria's behavior, though from opposite directions and for different purposes. His investigation had revealed her betrayal of the family's financial trust, just as mine had documented her systematic campaign to eliminate my influence over the family's future. Why should I trust you now, Dad? You chose Victoria over me once, and you might do it again when this crisis passes and she reasserts her influence over your decisions. The question struck at the heart of my concerns about any potential reconciliation. Even if Dad was genuinely remorseful about our estrangement, even if he recognized Victoria's manipulation, he was still married to her, and would presumably return to sharing a household and daily life with someone who viewed me as a threat to her children's inheritance. Because I'm dying, Claire, and I want to make sure the people I love are protected after I'm gone. That includes you, and it includes Kevin and Natalie, but it doesn't include preserving Victoria's ability to destroy what's left of our family's security. The statement was both heartbreaking and coldly practical, suggesting that Dad had moved beyond trying to maintain his marriage, and was focused on salvaging whatever legacy he could create for his children. Victoria had become a liability rather than a partner in his mind, though I suspected she didn't yet understand how completely her influence over him had deteriorated. I need time to consider your proposal, I said finally. And I need complete transparency about the family's financial situation, including any other debts or obligations that haven't been disclosed. Dad nodded, apparently having expected this response. Patricia has prepared a comprehensive financial disclosure that includes everything I've been able to discover about our situation. Take whatever time you need to review it, but please keep in mind that we have less than 60 days before the bankruptcy and foreclosure proceedings make any rescue impossible. I accepted the thick envelope of documents Patricia offered, recognizing that I was crossing a threshold that would change my relationship with the family permanently regardless of what decision I ultimately made. Simply by agreeing to consider their request, I was acknowledging that some part of me still cared about their welfare despite years of estrangement. I'll have an answer for you within 2 weeks, I said, standing to indicate that our meeting was concluded. Dad stood as well, his movements still careful, but more hopeful than when I'd arrived. Claire, I know I don't deserve your help, and I know I can't undo the damage I've caused. But I want you to know that losing you has been the biggest regret of my life, and that everything I've built feels meaningless if you're not part of it. The words were exactly what I'd needed to hear 7 years ago, and they still carried emotional weight despite arriving too late to prevent the pain of separation they'd caused. But they also created an opportunity for something I hadn't expected when I'd walked into Patricia's office that morning, the chance to reclaim not just my place in the family, but my power to determine what that family would become. The flight back to Seattle gave me 3 hours to process the magnitude of what Dad had revealed and what he was asking me to consider. The financial documents Patricia had provided painted a picture of destruction so comprehensive that I wondered whether any amount of money could actually save what Victoria had spent years dismantling. But buried within the chaos of their situation, I could see possibilities that went far beyond simple financial rescue. If I chose to help them, I wouldn't just be providing emergency funding, I would be assuming control over the family's entire future. Dad's offer of 50% partnership in Donovan Construction, combined with the leverage that came from being their primary creditor, would give me authority over every significant decision affecting their lives. Victoria, who had spent 8 years positioning herself as the family's financial mastermind, would find herself answering to the daughter she'd worked so hard to eliminate. Back in my Seattle office, I spread the financial documents across the conference table and began conducting the kind of comprehensive analysis I would perform for any potential business investment. The numbers were even worse than Dad had indicated during our meeting, with hidden liabilities and contingent obligations that suggested the family's total debt exceeded $4 million, rather than the $3 million he'd disclosed. Victoria had been creative in her borrowing strategies, using multiple credit sources and complex financial instruments to extract maximum value from their assets, while obscuring the true extent of their obligations. She'd taken cash advances against Dad's life insurance policies, borrowed against Kevin's future earning potential through specialized student loan products, and even secured lines of credit against Natalie's potential modeling and dance career earnings. The sophistication of Victoria's financial manipulation was impressive in its thoroughness and terrifying in its implications. She hadn't just mortgaged the family's current assets, she'd mortgaged their children's futures, creating debt obligations that would follow Kevin and Natalie for decades, regardless of whether Donovan Construction survived or thrived. But Victoria's elaborate financial engineering had also created vulnerabilities that someone with sufficient resources could exploit. Many of the loans and credit agreements included acceleration clauses that could be triggered by changes in ownership or management structure. If I acquired controlling interest in Donovan Construction, I could potentially renegotiate or eliminate several of the most burdensome debt obligations, while consolidating others under more favorable terms. More significantly, Victoria's pattern of moving money into personal accounts and preparing for Dad's death had created a paper trail that could be used to challenge any claims she might make to assets acquired during their marriage. Her own financial records, which Dad's investigator had documented, provided evidence of what family law attorneys would recognize as asset dissipation and spousal financial misconduct. I called Marcus Chen, my business partner, and asked him to review the Donovan Construction documents from an investor's perspective. Marcus had started his career in corporate restructuring before joining me in consulting, and his expertise in troubled company analysis would help me understand whether the construction business had any salvageable value beneath the layers of debt Victoria had accumulated. His assessment, delivered over dinner at our favorite downtown restaurant, was both sobering and encouraging. "The core business is actually solid," he said, studying financial projections I'd prepared based on the company's historical performance. "Your father built a reputation for quality work and reliable service that still has value in the Portland market. The problem isn't the business model, it's the capital structure Victoria created to fund expansion." Marcus had identified the same pattern I'd noticed. Donovan Construction was failing not because of operational problems but because of financial engineering that had prioritized growth over sustainability. The contracts Dad had secured were profitable when executed efficiently, but the debt service requirements Victoria had created made it impossible to complete projects without borrowing additional money at increasingly unfavorable terms. If someone eliminated the existing debt and provided working capital for current projects, this could be a very profitable operation, Marcus continued. "The question is whether you want to be in the construction business, and whether the emotional complications of working with your family would interfere with making good business decisions." That was indeed the question that would determine how I responded to Dad's request. I could provide emergency funding to prevent bankruptcy and foreclosure while maintaining my distance from their daily operations, essentially acting as a passive investor who had saved them from Victoria's mistakes. Or I could use their crisis as an opportunity to rebuild relationships that had been severed by manipulation and misunderstanding, accepting the emotional risks that came with genuine involvement in their lives. The decision became clearer when James Morrison called with updated intelligence about Victoria's recent activities. Her preparations for Dad's death had accelerated, with consultations about widow's benefits, life insurance claims, and strategies for protecting personal assets from business creditors. She was apparently planning to emerge from their financial collapse as a financially independent widow, rather than working to preserve the family business Dad had spent his career building. Most disturbing, James had discovered that Victoria was meeting with real estate agents about selling the Lake Oswego house despite knowing that Dad was trying to arrange financing to prevent foreclosure. She was apparently preparing to liquidate their most significant asset while he was seeking loans to preserve it, suggesting that her goals were no longer aligned with his or with the family's collective interests. "She's cutting her losses," James explained during our phone conversation. "Victoria has apparently decided that your father's illness makes him a liability rather than an asset, and she's positioning herself to survive his death with whatever resources she can protect or acquire independently." This revelation transformed my understanding of the family's situation and my potential role in resolving it. Victoria wasn't just struggling with debt she'd accumulated through poor decisions, she was actively working against Dad's efforts to solve their problems, apparently viewing his death as a solution that would free her from obligations she no longer wanted to honor. If I provided financial assistance to help Dad rebuild the business and preserve their home, I would be directly opposing Victoria's strategy for managing their crisis. She would undoubtedly view my involvement as an attack on her plans and would work to undermine any solutions that didn't serve her personal interests. But Victoria's disloyalty to Dad also meant that helping him wouldn't require maintaining peace with her or accommodating her preferences. I could structure any assistance in ways that protected Dad's interests while limiting her access to funds or decision-making authority. The daughter she'd spent 8 years trying to eliminate could become the guardian of assets she'd been planning to inherit. I spent the weekend reviewing legal options with attorneys who specialized in family business structures and estate planning. The possibilities were more extensive than I'd initially realized, particularly given Victoria's documented history of financial misconduct and asset manipulation. With proper legal framework, I could provide assistance to Dad while ensuring that Victoria's access to family resources was limited and monitored. The most elegant solution involved creating a family-limited partnership that would hold ownership of both Donovan Construction and the Lake Oswego house. I would provide the capital needed to satisfy existing debts and fund ongoing operations, while Dad would contribute the business assets and real estate as his partnership interest. Victoria would have no automatic claim to partnership assets, and her access to income or distributions would be determined by partnership agreements rather than marriage laws. This structure would also provide significant tax advantages and estate planning benefits that could help Dad maximize whatever legacy he was able to create for Kevin and Natalie. More importantly, it would ensure that the children's inheritance would be protected from any future financial mistakes Victoria might make and would continue to grow under professional management even after Dad's death. By the following Wednesday, I had developed a comprehensive proposal that addressed both the immediate crisis and the long-term challenges facing the family. The financial rescue would require an initial investment of $2 million, with additional funds available for business expansion and property improvements as needed. In exchange, I would receive 60% ownership of the partnership, with Dad retaining 30% and Kevin and Natalie each receiving 5% as their inheritance. The partnership agreement would include specific provisions limiting Victoria's access to partnership assets and requiring majority approval for any major financial decisions. She would be entitled to reasonable living expenses and housing in the Lake Oswego home, but she would not have the authority to mortgage, sell, or encumber partnership property without unanimous consent from all partners. Most significantly, the agreement would include mandatory financial reporting requirements and professional auditing that would prevent the kind of hidden borrowing and asset manipulation Victoria had used to create their current crisis. Every expenditure over a modest threshold would require documentation and approval, ensuring transparency in all financial decisions affecting the partnership's assets. I called Dad on Thursday morning and arranged another meeting for the following week, this time including Kevin and Natalie, so they could understand how any assistance I provided would affect their futures. Both children were now adults. Kevin was 26 and in his second year of law school, while Natalie was 24 and pursuing professional dance opportunities in Los Angeles, and they had the right to understand the family's situation and participate in decisions about their inheritance. Dad agreed to the expanded meeting, though his voice carried concern about how Victoria would react to being excluded from discussions about the family's financial future. I made it clear that Victoria's participation was not negotiable. Her history of financial manipulation made her presence counterproductive to finding solutions that would actually protect the family's long-term interests. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Patricia Hoffman's office, with Kevin flying up from Stanford and Natalie driving up from Los Angeles. I arranged to arrive Monday evening so I could have individual conversations with each of them before our group discussion, wanting to understand their perspectives on the family's situation and their relationships with both Dad and Victoria. Monday night found me sitting in the lobby bar of a downtown Portland hotel, waiting for Kevin to join me for what would be our first conversation in over 8 years. The young man who approached my table bore little resemblance to the awkward 15-year-old I remembered from Victoria's dinner parties. Kevin had grown into someone who projected intelligence and confidence, though I could see traces of stress around his eyes that suggested he was more aware of the family's problems than his mother might have realized. "Claire," he said, extending his hand with a formality that acknowledged both our family connection and the years of separation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I know this situation is complicated, and I appreciate your willingness to consider helping Dad." We ordered drinks and spent several minutes navigating the awkwardness of reconnecting with someone who was technically family but essentially a stranger. Kevin had inherited his mother's social skills, making conversation flow smoothly while carefully avoiding topics that might create conflict or discomfort. But as the evening progressed and he relaxed, a different picture emerged of the family dynamics I'd been excluded from. Kevin had been aware of Dad's declining health for over a year, and he'd grown increasingly concerned about Victoria's financial management as bills went unpaid and assets disappeared without explanation. He'd tried to discuss his concerns with his mother, but she dismissed his questions as inappropriate interference in adult matters he didn't understand. "I started doing my own research about 6 months ago," Kevin admitted, his law school training evident in his methodical approach to gathering information. "What I discovered about our financial situation scared me enough that I considered dropping out of school to try to help Dad figure out what was happening with the business." Kevin had reached many of the same conclusions that Dad's private investigator had documented, though from the perspective of someone living in the household and observing daily interactions. He'd noticed Victoria's secretive phone conversations with attorneys and financial advisors, her research into asset protection strategies, and her increasing focus on preserving her own financial security rather than solving their collective problems. Most troubling, Kevin had overheard conversations between Victoria and her brother Derek about strategies for managing Dad's estate after his death. These discussions had included speculation about challenging any will provisions that favored me over Victoria's children, along with research into legal arguments that could support such challenges. "Mom has never accepted that you might have legitimate claims to Dad's estate," Kevin said carefully. "She's spent years convincing herself that you abandoned the family, and therefore forfeited any right to inherit from Dad. But I don't think she's considered the possibility that you might be in a position to help us rather than compete with us for inheritance." The conversation revealed that Kevin had a more sophisticated understanding of the family's dynamics than I'd expected, and that his loyalty to Victoria was tempered by genuine concern for Dad's welfare and his own future security. He seemed genuinely interested in solutions that would preserve relationships rather than destroy them, though he was realistic about the challenges that Victoria's resistance would create. My dinner with Natalie the following evening painted a similar picture from a different perspective. Natalie had inherited more of Victoria's direct communication style, and she was less diplomatic in describing her frustration with the family's situation and her mother's role in creating it. "Mom has been lying to all of us for months about how bad things really are," Natalie said over appetizers at a trendy restaurant in the Pearl District. "She keeps saying that Dad's health problems are temporary setbacks, and that the business will recover once he's feeling better. But I've seen the bills, Claire. I know we're about to lose the house, and I know my dance program has been canceled because they can't pay the tuition. Natalie's anger was more apparent than Kevin's, though it seemed directed at the situation rather than at specific family members. She was frustrated by Victoria's refusal to acknowledge the severity of their crisis, and by Dad's apparent helplessness in the face of problems he didn't fully understand. She'd been considering moving back to Portland to try to help with the business, though she recognized that her background in dance and performance wouldn't necessarily translate to useful business skills. I love Mom, but I don't trust her judgment about money anymore. Natalie continued. She convinced Dad to spend everything we had on expanding the business and buying that huge house, and now she's acting like their mistakes are somehow everyone else's fault. When Kevin and I try to ask questions or offer suggestions, she tells us we don't understand adult responsibilities. Both conversations reinforced my impression that Kevin and Natalie were intelligent, responsible young adults who deserved better than being caught in the middle of their mother's financial schemes and their stepfather's health crisis. They'd been excluded from family financial decisions despite being old enough to contribute meaningfully to finding solutions, and their futures were being jeopardized by choices they'd had no role in making. More importantly, both children seemed genuinely interested in rebuilding a relationship with me that had been severed by circumstances beyond their control. Neither of them had supported Victoria's campaign to eliminate me from the family, and both had questioned the wisdom of cutting off contact with someone who clearly cared about Dad's welfare and their own success. Tuesday morning's meeting at Patricia's office brought together 4 people who shared family connections but had spent years living essentially separate lives. Dad looked frailer than he had the previous week, with the kind of exhaustion that suggested his illness was progressing faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Kevin and Natalie flanked him at the conference table, their body language protective in a way that spoke to their genuine affection for the man who'd raised them as his own children. I presented my proposal for the family limited partnership with the kind of professional thoroughness I would use for any significant business deal. The financial terms were generous but structured to prevent future manipulation or mismanagement. The governance provisions ensured that all partners would have appropriate input into major decisions while preventing any single person from repeating Victoria's pattern of unilateral financial control. Dad listened intently, asking questions that demonstrated his continued grasp of business principles despite his physical weakness. Kevin took detailed notes, his legal training helping him understand the implications of various contract provisions and partnership structures. Natalie asked practical questions about how the arrangement would affect their daily lives and future opportunities. The discussion continued for nearly 3 hours, covering scenarios and contingencies that might arise as the partnership evolved. By the end of the meeting, we had reached agreement on all major terms and had authorized Patricia to begin drafting the legal documents needed to implement the arrangement. But the most significant moment came when Dad asked Kevin and Natalie to step out of the room so he could speak with me privately. Once we were alone, his formal business demeanor dissolved into something more personal and vulnerable. "Claire, I need you to understand that this isn't just about money," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of regret. "I know I can't undo the damage I caused by choosing Victoria's version of our family over the truth of what you meant to me. But I hope that working together to rebuild what she damaged might give us a chance to rebuild our relationship as well." The words carried more emotional impact than all of the financial negotiations we'd just completed. For the first time since our estrangement began, Dad was acknowledging not just that mistakes had been made, but that he had made them, and that restoring our relationship was worth the complications it would create in his marriage. "I hope so too, Dad," I replied, meaning it despite the protective walls I'd built around my emotions. "But you need to understand that Victoria isn't going to accept this arrangement quietly. She's going to fight to maintain control over the family's finances, and that's going to create conflict that affects everyone." Dad nodded, apparently having considered this reality during the days since our previous meeting. "Victoria will have to adjust to new circumstances, just like the rest of us. Her preferences are no longer the determining factor in family decisions, and it's time she learned that lesson." The statement represented a fundamental shift in Dad's relationship with his wife, though I wondered whether he fully understood the implications of challenging someone who had spent 8 years believing she controlled the family's destiny. Victoria had never faced serious opposition to her authority, and her response to suddenly finding herself powerless would likely be both emotional and strategic. "She knows about today's meeting?" I asked. "Victoria knows I'm meeting with you to discuss financial assistance. She doesn't know the specific terms we've agreed to, and she doesn't know that Kevin and Natalie were included in the discussion." I thought it would be better to present her with a completed agreement rather than giving her opportunities to interfere with negotiations. Dad's strategy made sense from a practical standpoint, but it also ensured that Victoria's first reaction to learning about the partnership would be anger at being excluded from decisions affecting her future. She would likely view the arrangement as a conspiracy between Dad and me to strip her of the authority she'd spent years accumulating. "When are you planning to tell her?" I asked. "Tonight. Patricia will have preliminary documents ready by this afternoon, and I want Victoria to understand that this arrangement is final rather than negotiable." The conversation was interrupted by Kevin and Natalie returning to the conference room, their expressions suggesting they'd use the time alone to process everything they'd learned about the family's situation and their potential future within the partnership structure. Both seemed cautiously optimistic about the possibilities for rebuilding relationships while stabilizing their financial security. We concluded the meeting with agreements about next steps and timelines for implementing the partnership arrangement. Patricia would complete the legal documents within a week, while I arranged for the initial capital injection needed to prevent bankruptcy and foreclosure proceedings. Kevin and Natalie would be kept informed about all developments, ensuring they understood how decisions affected their inheritance and future opportunities. As we prepared to leave Patricia's office, Kevin approached me with a request that caught me off guard. "Claire, I know this is complicated given everything that's happened between you and Mom, but would you consider having dinner with our family sometime soon? Not to negotiate or discuss business, but just to spend time together as people who care about Dad and want what's best for everyone." The invitation represented exactly the kind of emotional risk I'd been avoiding since Dad's phone call 7 years earlier. Sharing a meal with Victoria would require navigating years of accumulated hostility and mistrust, with no guarantee that her response to the new partnership arrangement would leave room for civil interaction. But Kevin's request also offered an opportunity to demonstrate that my return to the family wasn't motivated by revenge or a desire to punish Victoria for past manipulations. If I could maintain dignity and grace while establishing new boundaries, I might be able to create conditions where genuine healing could begin. "Let me see how Victoria responds to learning about our partnership," I said finally. "If she's willing to accept the new arrangement and work constructively within it, then I'd be happy to join you for dinner." That evening, from my hotel room overlooking the Willamette River, I received a series of text messages from Dad that documented Victoria's reaction to learning about the partnership agreement. Her initial response had been disbelief, followed by anger when she realized that the arrangement significantly limited her financial authority and eliminated her access to partnership assets without majority approval. The confrontation had apparently escalated quickly, with Victoria demanding that Dad reject the partnership offer and find alternative solutions that preserved her role in family financial decisions. When Dad explained that no such alternatives existed given their current crisis, Victoria had accused him of conspiring with me to steal her children's inheritance. The accusations had grown more dramatic throughout the evening, with Victoria claiming that I was manipulating Dad's illness to gain control over family assets, and that the partnership was a scheme to punish her for past disagreements. She'd threatened to consult with her own attorney about challenging the arrangement and had suggested that Dad's illness made him vulnerable to undue influence. But Dad's final text message suggested that Victoria's emotional outburst had actually strengthened his resolve to move forward with the partnership. Her refusal to acknowledge responsibility for their financial crisis, combined with her continued focus on preserving her own authority rather than solving their problems, had apparently convinced him that our arrangement represented his best hope for protecting Kevin and Natalie's future. The battle for control of the Donovan family's future had officially begun, with Victoria finally understanding that the daughter she'd successfully eliminated from their lives had returned with enough power to determine their fate. Her next moves would reveal whether she was capable of adapting to circumstances she could no longer control, or whether her response to losing authority would create additional chaos that threatened everyone's security. But for the first time in 8 years, I held the advantage in a conflict I'd never chosen to enter. Victoria had taught me that family relationships could be weaponized, that love could be conditional, and that security required independence from other people's approval. Now I had the opportunity to demonstrate what those lessons looked like when applied by someone with the resources and determination to reshape a family's destiny on my own terms. 3 months after signing the partnership agreement, I stood in the renovated offices of Donovan Construction, watching Dad review quarterly financial reports that showed the company's first profitable period in over 2 years. The transformation had been remarkable and swift, with proper capitalization and professional management eliminating the cash flow crises that had plagued the business under Victoria's influence. The construction crews were completing projects on schedule and under budget, their morale restored by consistent paychecks and clear leadership. We'd landed 3 major commercial contracts that would sustain operations for the next 18 months, with potential expansions into markets Dad had never considered accessible. The Lake Oswego house was no longer facing foreclosure, Kevin had resumed his law school studies, and Natalie was thriving in a prestigious dance program we'd helped her secure in Portland. But the most significant change wasn't reflected in financial statements or business metrics. It was visible in Dad's face as he discussed plans for the future with the kind of enthusiasm I remembered from my childhood, when he'd talked about building something meaningful that could support our family for generations. Victoria had been conspicuously absent from the office during my visits, though her presence lingered in the form of questions she'd instructed Kevin to ask about business decisions and financial allocations. She'd never directly challenged the partnership arrangement after her initial explosive reaction, but she'd maintained a campaign of passive resistance designed to complicate implementation of our agreements. Her strategy had evolved from open confrontation to subtle undermining, with complaints about feeling excluded from family decisions and concerns about my motivations for helping them. Victoria had apparently convinced herself that my assistance came with hidden costs that would eventually be revealed through demands for gratitude or control over personal aspects of their lives. The reality was both simpler and more complicated than Victoria's suspicions. I had no interest in controlling their daily lives or extracting emotional payments for financial assistance. But I was absolutely committed to preventing any return to the pattern of financial manipulation and family discord that had characterized the Victoria era of Donovan family dynamics. This commitment had required establishing boundaries that Victoria found difficult to accept. She was no longer authorized to make financial decisions affecting the business or household without consultation and approval. Her access to credit and banking was monitored through the partnership's financial oversight requirements. Most significantly, she'd been excluded from estate planning discussions that would determine how assets were distributed after Dad's death. These restrictions weren't punitive measures designed to humiliate or control Victoria, but they were comprehensive enough to prevent her from repeating the destructive patterns that had nearly destroyed everything Dad had worked to build. She'd proven herself capable of making decisions that prioritized her short-term preferences over the family's long-term security, and the partnership structure simply eliminated her ability to make such decisions in the future. But Victoria's adjustment to her reduced circumstances had been more difficult than anyone had anticipated. She'd spent 8 years believing herself to be the family's financial mastermind and primary decision-maker, and discovering that she was now accountable to others for choices that affected their shared resources had triggered responses ranging from sullen resentment to dramatic accusations of persecution. The situation came to a head on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November, when Victoria appeared at the construction office demanding an immediate meeting with both Dad and me. She'd apparently reached the limits of her tolerance for what she viewed as systematic exclusion from family business, and she was prepared to force a confrontation that would either restore her authority or clarify the terms of our ongoing relationship. Dad had been expecting this confrontation for weeks, though he'd hoped Victoria would eventually accept the new arrangements without requiring explicit discussions about power and accountability. Her arrival at the office suggested that hope had been unrealistic, and that sustainable family dynamics would require direct negotiation of boundaries and expectations. Victoria entered the conference room with the kind of determined energy that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation for months. She was impeccably dressed, her presentation materials organized, and her demeanor professional rather than emotional. Whatever she'd planned to say, she intended to deliver it with the authority and persuasiveness that had once allowed her to dominate family decisions. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room," she began, settling into a chair across from Dad and me with the confidence of someone who believed she held winning cards. "This partnership arrangement has created an unsustainable dynamic that's destroying our family relationships and undermining the unity we've worked so hard to build." She'd prepared a detailed analysis of what she characterized as problems with the current business structure, including concerns about my geographic distance from Portland, questions about my long-term commitment to the construction industry, and observations about the emotional strain that family business relationships could create for everyone involved. But Victoria's most serious concern was what she described as the partnership's interference with natural family hierarchies and relationships. She argued that Dad's illness made him vulnerable to undue influence, that Kevin and Natalie were being forced to choose sides in conflicts they didn't understand, and that my sudden reappearance in their lives was preventing the healing that should naturally follow family crises. "Claire, I appreciate what you've done to help us through this difficult period," Victoria said, her tone carefully modulated to sound reasonable rather than confrontational. But I think we all recognize that your assistance was meant to be temporary emergency support, not a permanent restructuring of family relationships and decision-making authority. The speech was masterfully constructed, acknowledging my contributions while positioning them as excessive and potentially harmful to family harmony. Victoria was essentially arguing that gratitude for my help should translate into voluntary withdrawal from ongoing involvement in their lives, allowing them to return to the pre-crisis status quo with financial problems solved but power structures unchanged. Dad's response surprised me with its directness and finality. Victoria, the problems we faced weren't temporary emergency situations that could be solved with short-term assistance. They were the result of systematic financial mismanagement that put everything I've worked for at risk. The partnership arrangement isn't a temporary measure. It's the permanent solution that ensures we'll never face bankruptcy and foreclosure again. Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly as Dad continued with observations about her role in creating their crisis. He'd apparently been preparing for this conversation as thoroughly as she had, and his assessment of her financial decision-making was both comprehensive and damning. You mortgaged our home multiple times without my full understanding of the terms. You borrowed against the children's futures without considering the long-term implications. You moved money into personal accounts while telling me we couldn't afford basic business expenses. You researched strategies for protecting yourself financially while leaving the rest of us vulnerable to creditors and bankruptcy courts. Each accusation was supported by documentation Dad had gathered through his own investigation of their finances, creating a record of Victoria's actions that was difficult to dispute or rationalize. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had prioritized personal financial security over family welfare, often through deception and manipulation. Victoria's response revealed the depth of her miscalculation about the family's current dynamics and her own position within them. She'd apparently believed that Dad's gratitude for my assistance would be temporary, and that his loyalty to their marriage would eventually override his business judgment. Instead, she was discovering that Dad's illness had clarified rather than clouded his priorities, and that those priorities no longer included preserving her authority over family decisions. Robert, I made those financial decisions to protect our family's future and maximize our opportunities for growth, Victoria said, her voice carrying the first hints of desperation. Every choice I made was motivated by love for you and the children, and I resent the implication that I was somehow working against your interests. But Dad had moved beyond accepting Victoria's explanations and justifications for decisions that had nearly destroyed everything he'd built. His illness had apparently given him perspective on the difference between genuine partnership and manipulation disguised as support, and he was no longer willing to pretend that Victoria's financial management had been beneficial for anyone except herself. If your decisions were motivated by love for our family, then you won't object to accountability measures that ensure future decisions actually serve our collective interests. Dad replied, the partnership structure protects everyone's security while preventing the kind of unilateral decision-making that created our crisis. The confrontation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Victoria alternating between attempts to negotiate modifications to the partnership agreement and emotional appeals for Dad to choose their marriage over his business relationship with me. But each argument she presented only reinforced Dad's conviction that the current arrangement was necessary for the family's long-term survival and prosperity. Victoria's final gambit was the most revealing, exposing the calculations that had always driven her approach to family relationships. She threatened to leave Dad unless he modified the partnership agreement to restore her financial authority, apparently believing that fear of abandonment during his illness would motivate concessions she couldn't achieve through other means. I didn't sign up for a marriage where I'm treated like a dependent rather than a partner, Victoria said, her voice carrying both anger and calculated manipulation. If you're not willing to trust me with appropriate responsibility for our family's financial decisions, then maybe we need to reconsider whether this marriage is working for either of us. The threat backfired spectacularly, revealing to Dad that Victoria viewed their marriage as a negotiating position rather than a commitment that transcended temporary disagreements about business arrangements. Her willingness to abandon him during his illness in order to regain control over finances demonstrated exactly the kind of conditional loyalty that the partnership structure had been designed to prevent. Dad's response was quiet but definitive. Victoria, if your commitment to our marriage depends on your ability to make unilateral financial decisions that put our family at risk, then you're right that we should reconsider our relationship. But the partnership arrangement isn't negotiable, and threatening to leave won't change the terms we've agreed to. Victoria's face went white as she realized that her threat had been called and found empty. She'd apparently expected Dad to choose preserving their marriage over protecting the family's financial security, but instead she'd discovered that his priorities had shifted in ways that made her ultimatum counterproductive. The meeting ended with Victoria storming out of the office, though her dramatic exit felt more like a tantrum than a genuine departure. She'd challenged the new power structure and lost decisively, learning that neither Dad nor I was willing to sacrifice the family's stability to accommodate her need for financial control. But Victoria's confrontation had also served a useful purpose by forcing explicit discussion of boundaries and expectations that had been implicit in the partnership agreement. Everyone now understood that the current arrangement was permanent rather than temporary, and that future family harmony would require acceptance of new realities rather than attempts to restore old patterns. 3 weeks after Victoria's ultimatum, Kevin called to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner at the Lake Oswego house. The holiday would mark my first visit to the family home since Victoria had convinced Dad to cut me off 8 years earlier, and Kevin was hopeful that the occasion might provide opportunities for healing relationships that had been damaged by years of conflict and misunderstanding. I accepted the invitation with mixed emotions, recognizing both the symbolic importance of returning to the family table and the potential for renewed conflict if Victoria had been nurturing resentment since her failed confrontation at the office. But Dad's health was declining more rapidly than anyone had expected, and the opportunity to share what might be one of his final holiday celebrations outweighed my concerns about uncomfortable social dynamics. The house looked much the same as I remembered, though I noticed signs of the financial constraints that had preceded my involvement in their lives. Some of the expensive artwork and decorative items that had once impressed visitors were missing, presumably sold to generate cash during their crisis period. The landscaping was less elaborate than it had been during Victoria's peak spending years, and some maintenance issues suggested that household expenses had been deferred when money was tight. But the house still projected prosperity and success, and the dining room had been decorated for Thanksgiving with the kind of attention to detail that had always characterized Victoria's approach to entertaining. Whatever her feelings about the partnership arrangement, she'd apparently decided that family gatherings should maintain the standards of elegance and hospitality that had defined their social identity. Dad looked frailer than he had during our office meetings, though his spirits seemed genuinely improved by having the family gathered around their table for the first time in months. Kevin and Natalie flanked him protectively, their conversation animated and affectionate in ways that spoke to their deep love for the man who had raised them with patience and generosity. Victoria's behavior throughout the meal was scrupulously polite, though I could sense the effort required for her to maintain civility towards someone she undoubtedly viewed as the architect of her reduced circumstances. She asked appropriate questions about my business and life in Seattle, complimented the partnership's positive effects on Dad's health and mood, and even expressed what sounded like genuine gratitude for my role in preserving their home and financial security. But underneath her gracious hostess performance, I could detect the kind of calculated assessment that had always characterized Victoria's approach to relationships. She was apparently trying to determine whether my ongoing involvement in the family represented a permanent threat to her influence, or a temporary disruption that might eventually be managed or minimized. The most revealing moment came during dessert, when Victoria made what sounded like a casual observation about the challenges of blended families and the importance of forgiveness and healing old wounds. Her comments were directed toward Dad and me, though their broader implications clearly included her own relationship with family members who had questioned her judgment and authority. I've learned that holding grudges and dwelling on past mistakes prevents families from moving forward together, Victoria said, her voice carrying what sounded like sincere reflection. Everyone makes decisions they later regret, and the key to family harmony is focusing on shared goals rather than past disagreements. The statement was simultaneously an apology and a request for amnesty, acknowledging that mistakes had been made while seeking assurance that ongoing accountability wouldn't be required for past actions. Victoria was apparently hoping that the success of the partnership arrangement might create conditions for returning to previous relationship patterns, with her errors forgiven and her authority gradually restored through demonstrated good behavior. But Dad's response made it clear that forgiveness and trust were different concepts, and that rebuilding relationships didn't automatically mean resuming old patterns of decision-making and financial control. He appreciated Victoria's acknowledgement of past mistakes, but he also believed that lasting change required structural safeguards rather than relying on good intentions and promises of improved behavior. I'm grateful for everything this family has taught me about resilience and the importance of working together during difficult times, Dad said, his words encompassing everyone around the table. But I've also learned that protecting the people we love sometimes requires making decisions that feel uncomfortable but serve everyone's long-term interests. The conversation continued through coffee and into the evening, covering topics ranging from Kevin's law school experiences to Natalie's upcoming dance performances to my own business expansion plans. The atmosphere was genuinely warm and familial, though I remained conscious of the underlying tensions that would need ongoing management as we all adjusted to changed circumstances. As I prepared to leave that evening, Dad asked for a few minutes of private conversation in his study. The room had once been Mom's favorite space for reading and correspondence, and I was surprised to see that he'd restored some of her personal items that had been packed away during Victoria's redecorating phases. "I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be your father again," Dad said, settling into the leather chair where he'd once helped me with homework and listened to my teenage concerns about school and friendships. "I know I failed you when you needed me most, and I know that trusting me again required courage I'm not sure I would have had in your position." His words carried the weight of genuine remorse and appreciation, acknowledging both the depth of damage our relationship had sustained and the generosity required for me to risk additional hurt by reconnecting with family members who had once rejected me completely. "I'm just grateful we found our way back to each other before it was too late," I replied, meaning it despite the protective caution that still guarded parts of my heart. "Mom would be proud of what we've built together, and she'd be proud of the legacy you're creating for Kevin and Natalie." Dad's eyes filled with tears as he reached for a small wrapped package he'd placed on the table beside his chair. "I have something for you that should have been given to you years ago, but Victoria convinced me to wait until you were ready to appreciate its significance. I think that time has finally come." Inside the package was my mother's engagement ring, the simple but elegant solitaire that had symbolized my parents' partnership and shared dreams for the future. Dad had apparently preserved it through all the years of Victoria's influence, waiting for the right moment to pass it on to the daughter Mom had loved so fiercely. "She wanted you to have this when you were ready to understand what real love and commitment look like," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think she'd be amazed by the woman you've become, and the strength you've shown in rebuilding our family when we needed you most." The ring fit perfectly, as if Mom had somehow known it would find its way to me when the time was right. Wearing it felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that had been lost during the years of exile, a tangible connection to the love that had shaped my earliest understanding of family and belonging. 6 months later, I received the phone call I'd been expecting but hoping wouldn't come so soon. Dad had passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Kevin and Natalie at his bedside and Victoria maintaining her vigil in the hallway outside his room. His death marked the end of an era for the Donovan family, and the beginning of a new chapter that would test whether the foundations we'd rebuilt together were strong enough to survive his absence. The funeral service was held at the same church where my parents had been married 35 years earlier, and where Mom's memorial service had taken place 11 years before. The sanctuary was filled with people whose lives had been touched by Dad's kindness, generosity, and integrity, including construction workers who had learned their trade under his mentorship and clients who had become lifelong friends through their business relationships. Victoria delivered a eulogy that was both moving and revealing, acknowledging Dad's role as a devoted husband and father while carefully avoiding any reference to the financial struggles that had marked his final years. Her presentation was polished and appropriate, though I couldn't help noticing that her version of Dad's legacy focused on personal qualities rather than the business achievements and family reconciliation that had defined his recent priorities. But the most meaningful moment of the service came when Kevin and Natalie asked me to share memories of Dad from my childhood, recognizing that I'd known him longer than anyone else in attendance and had witnessed aspects of his character that predated his marriage to their mother. Their invitation represented acceptance of my role in the family that transcended financial arrangements or legal partnerships. Speaking about Dad from the church pulpit where he'd been married to Mom felt like completing a circle that had been broken by years of estrangement and manipulation. I shared stories about his patient teaching during my teenage driving lessons, his pride in my academic achievements, his support during my early career struggles, and his joy in rebuilding our relationship during his final months. But I also spoke about the lessons he'd taught me about resilience, accountability, and the difference between loving someone and enabling their destructive behavior. Dad's willingness to change course when he recognized that Victoria's financial management was threatening the family's security had demonstrated the kind of moral courage that defined genuine leadership. The reception following the service provided opportunities for conversations with extended family members and longtime friends who had witnessed the various phases of Dad's life and marriages. Several people mentioned their relief that he'd reconciled with me before his death, acknowledging that his estrangement from his biological daughter had been a source of ongoing concern for people who cared about his happiness. But the most significant conversation took place when Victoria approached me near the end of the reception, requesting a private moment to discuss our future relationship and the partnership's implications for her ongoing security and involvement in family decisions. "Claire, I know we've had our differences over the years, but I hope we can work together to honor Robert's memory and protect the family he loved so much," Victoria said, her tone carrying the kind of diplomatic courtesy that suggested she'd prepared for this conversation carefully. Her approach was strategic rather than emotional, focusing on practical concerns about household management, financial oversight, and coordination of activities involving Kevin and Natalie. Victoria was apparently hoping to negotiate a modified relationship that would provide her with appropriate authority over family matters while acknowledging the partnership structure that now governed major financial decisions. "I'm committed to honoring Dad's wishes and protecting the interests of everyone he cared about," I replied, keeping my response equally diplomatic while avoiding specific commitments that might complicate future decisions. The partnership structure he helped create provides a framework for making those decisions collaboratively and transparently. Victoria's expression suggested she'd hoped for more concrete assurances about her role in family governance, but she seemed to recognize that pressing for specific concessions at Dad's funeral reception would be inappropriate and potentially counterproductive. Our conversation was interrupted by Kevin and Natalie, who wanted to discuss logistics for the following weeks and months as they processed their grief while managing practical responsibilities related to Dad's estate and the ongoing operation of Donovan construction. Both children had matured significantly during Dad's illness, taking on leadership roles within the family that reflected their developing judgment and their commitment to preserving his legacy. They'd also developed a sophisticated understanding of the partnership structure and their own roles within it, recognizing that their inheritance came with both privileges and responsibilities. Over the following months, the family's new dynamics evolved in ways that reflected both the success of the partnership structure and the ongoing challenges of managing relationships complicated by years of conflict and mistrust. Victoria adjusted to her reduced financial authority with varying degrees of grace, sometimes accepting her new circumstances and sometimes testing boundaries through subtle attempts to influence decisions she was no longer authorized to make unilaterally. But she also demonstrated capacity for growth and adaptation that surprised me, occasionally offering insights and suggestions that proved valuable for business operations or family planning. Victoria's experience and social skills remained assets for the family, even within the framework of shared decision-making that prevented any return to her previous pattern of unilateral control. Kevin completed law school with honors and joined a prestigious Portland firm, though he maintained active involvement in Donovan Construction's legal affairs and strategic planning. His legal training proved invaluable for navigating complex business decisions and ensuring that the partnership operated within appropriate regulatory and contractual frameworks. Natalie's dance career flourished under the financial stability the partnership provided, and she began developing programs that combined her artistic training with business education, creating revenue streams that complemented the construction company's operations. Her creative perspective often provided fresh approaches to challenges that benefited from innovative thinking. Most importantly, the family had learned to function as a collaborative unit, where everyone's interests were represented and protected, rather than as a hierarchy where one person's preferences determined outcomes for everyone else. The partnership structure had created space for individual growth and expression while maintaining collective security and shared purpose. 2 years after Dad's death, I moved back to Portland to assume more direct oversight of Donovan Construction's expansion into new markets and service offerings. The company had grown beyond Dad's original vision while maintaining his commitment to quality work and ethical business practices. Seattle remained my primary residence, but Portland had become the center of a family enterprise that honored his memory while adapting to changing opportunities and challenges. The Lake Oswego house had been renovated and updated to accommodate multiple family members and their evolving needs, with spaces designed for both private reflection and collaborative activities. Victoria maintained her own suite within the house, while Kevin and Natalie had areas that reflected their adult independence while preserving their connection to family traditions and shared experiences. But the most meaningful change was the restoration of family photographs and mementos that included all phases of Dad's life, creating a visual narrative that honored both my mother's memory and Victoria's contributions without suggesting that either relationship diminished the value of the other. The house had become a place where multiple family histories coexisted rather than competed for recognition and respect. Standing in Dad's former study on the second anniversary of his death, surrounded by the partnership agreements and family photographs that represented our rebuilt relationships, I realized that Victoria's original phone call begging me to save their house had accomplished something neither of us had anticipated. It had forced a reckoning with patterns of manipulation and exclusion that might otherwise have continued until Dad's death left everyone with unfinished business and unresolved grief. The daughter Victoria had worked so hard to eliminate from the family had indeed returned to save their house, but in the process I'd also saved the family itself from the destructive dynamics that had been poisoning their relationships for years. The power Victoria had tried to protect for her children had been transformed into something more valuable, genuine security based on shared responsibility rather than individual control. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give people who have hurt you is the opportunity to be better than they've been, even when they don't initially appreciate that opportunity. Dad had used his final years to rebuild bridges he'd allowed to burn, while Victoria had gradually discovered that influence based on manipulation was less satisfying than respect earned through contribution and collaboration. Kevin and Natalie had inherited more than money or property from their stepfather's legacy. They'd inherited a model of family relationship based on accountability, transparency, and mutual support that would serve them well as they built their own adult lives and relationships. The missing chair that had symbolized my exclusion from family gatherings years earlier had been replaced by a table large enough to accommodate everyone who belonged there, with room for future expansion as the family continued to grow and evolve. And somewhere I believed, Mom was proud of the daughter she'd raised to be strong enough to save the people she loved, even when they'd forgotten how to love her back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.